The smell of roasted coffee and perfume filled the air, as Elena carried a tray of sparkling glasses across the dining hall. The restaurant was glowing with soft golden lights, every table decorated with roses and candles. Elegant laughter echoed from every corner. But no one noticed the girl moving silently between them. She was just the waitress, the invisible one who made sure everyone else's night was perfect. Elena had been working at the Royal Garden restaurant for almost 2 years. It was the most famous place in the city, where businessmen, celebrities, and rich couples came to celebrate their success. Every night she watched them dressed in their finest clothes. Talking about money and art and travel, she smiled politely, nodded when spoken to, and then disappeared into the background again. But behind that quiet smile, her heart carried a secret. Before she was a waitress, she had been a student at the City Music Academy. Her fingers once danced across piano keys with dreams as bright as the stars. Her teacher used to say she had a gift, a natural connection to music that could make people feel what words could not. Elena believed him. She believed that one day she would stand on a grand stage, playing before an audience who listened not because she was rich or famous, but because she could make them feel something real. That dream ended 2 years ago when her mother fell ill. The hospital bills came like waves and no amount of hope could pay for the medicine. So Elena left the academy, sold her piano, and took the first job she could find, serving at the very restaurant where she once imagined performing. Now she spent her nights polishing silverware and smiling through exhaustion. Her hands, once meant for music, were now rough from dishwater and carrying heavy trays. Sometimes when the restaurant was empty after closing, she would sneak to the corner where the grand piano stood. She would touch the keys gently, like greeting an old friend she was forbidden to see. Then she would close her eyes and play the softest melody, afraid someone might hear. It was the only time she felt alive again. Tonight was one of the busiest nights of the year. A charity gala had been booked weeks in advance, and the place was filled with men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns. The air shimmered with expensive perfume and pride. Elena moved quickly between tables, her tray perfectly balanced, her face calm though her legs ached. She listened to the guests laugh about auctions, money and fame. She had learned to tune it out long ago. In the corner of the hall stood a shiny black grand piano, its lid open, waiting for the famous pianist Victor Dane, who was supposed to perform later in the evening. Elena's eyes lingered on it for a moment too long. She could see her reflection on its surface, the reflection of someone who had once belonged to that world but had been forced to walk away. Her heart tightened. She turned her gaze back to the tables and continued serving. When she passed by a group of ladies, she heard one of them complain about her glass being too warm. Another laughed and said, "What do you expect? These waitresses don't care about details." The word stung, but Elena kept her head down and whispered a polite apology. She had learned that arguing never helped. The world she worked in was made of masks, and she wore hers better than most. In the kitchen, steam rose from the pots, and the chef barked orders like a commander. The other waiters joked among themselves, but Elena stayed quiet. She didn't mind being alone. Silence had become her safest place. She hummed softly while arranging the desserts. The tune, something she had written years ago. It made her feel closer to the girl she used to be when she finally got a short break. She stepped outside for a moment. The night air was cool, and the city lights blinked in the distance. She looked up at the stars and whispered to herself. One day, it was a promise she didn't know how to keep, but it gave her strength to go back inside and keep moving. Inside, the manager rushed around, checking every detail before the main performance. Everyone was talking about Victor Dane's arrival. He was the star of the night, the one who would impress the crowd. Elena smiled faintly. She admired him, of course, but a part of her wondered what it felt like to be him, to walk into a room and have every eye turned to you, to sit at a piano and make people forget their problems for a few minutes. She sighed and went back to work. She carried trays, refilled glasses, and smiled at strangers who never learned her name yet. Even in that world of polished shoes and gold watches, she carried her invisible fire, her love for music that refused to die. As the clock ticked toward the start of the event, Elena felt a strange mix of peace and sadness. She told herself that she had accepted her life, that dreams were for other people now, but deep down, she knew that if she ever got one chance, just one, to play again, she would give it everything she had. And somewhere inside her heart, that small, Forgotten melody began to hum again, waiting for the right moment to be heard, waiting for fate to turn its gaze toward the invisible waitress who still dreamed beneath the noise of clinking glasses and quiet tears. The next evening came with excitement and pressure in the air. The restaurant looked more beautiful than ever before, shining with golden lights and crystal chandeliers that threw soft sparkles across the marble floor. Every table was dressed with white cloth, tall candles, and flowers that smelled of jasmine. The Royal Garden restaurant was ready for its grand charity gala. The biggest night of the year, Elena arrived early. Wearing her neat uniform and tying her brown hair into a tight bun, she stood in front of the mirror in the staff room for a moment, staring at her reflection. Her eyes looked tired, but she forced a smile. It was her habit now, smiling even when her heart was heavy. Tonight was not just any night. The most powerful people in the city would be here. Politicians, businessmen, movie stars, people whose names were printed in magazines. As she stepped into the main hall, she froze for a moment. In the center of the room, a grand piano stood on a small stage. Black and glossy under the soft lights, it looked like a sleeping giant, waiting for the touch that would bring it to life. Elena's heart skipped a beat. For a second, she forgot where she was. She could almost feel her fingers pressing the keys, the sound rising around her, the world fading away into music. But then a sharp voice broke her dream. "Elena, stop daydreaming and start polishing the glasses," the manager barked. She quickly nodded and rushed to her station. The other waiters were moving fast, setting up wine bottles, silver cutlery, and plates that looked too delicate to touch. The manager walked around with a clipboard, checking every detail twice. The tension was thick. Everyone wanted everything to be perfect for the guests. By 7 o'clock, the first cars started arriving. Expensive black vehicles lined up in front of the restaurant, each one stopping just long enough for a well-dressed couple to step out, flashing smiles and greeting photographers. Elena stood near the entrance, helping the hostess guide the guests to their seats. Her heart beat faster every time she heard laughter echoing from the tables. She had learned how to move like a shadow, graceful but unseen. From where she stood, she could see the piano again. The spotlight above it glowed faintly, ready to shine brighter when the famous pianist arrived, Victor Dane. Everyone knew his name. He was tall, elegant, and known for his passion. His music had a way of making people cry without knowing why. Elena had listened to his recordings many times on her old phone when she needed to remember what hope felt like. As she watched the stage, she imagined how it would feel to sit there, just for a moment. She imagined her hands finding the right notes, the sound flowing like water, the audience silent and spellbound. But the thought made her smile sadly. That world wasn't hers anymore. She was just a waitress in a world of diamonds and wine. And she reminded herself not to dream while working. The night grew busier as more guests arrived. Waiters rushed back and forth, trays filled with food and drinks. Elena's feet began to ache, but she didn't complain. She had learned to hide her pain behind a polite smile. At one table, a group of rich women were talking about the pianist's arrival. "I heard Victor Dane once played for the royal family," one said proudly, "and tonight we get to hear him live." "Imagine how much they paid him for this event," another whispered, laughing. Elena pretended not to hear, but inside her thoughts raced. How strange, she thought, that one person's art could bring so much admiration, while someone else's went unnoticed simply because of who they were. Around 8 o'clock, the atmosphere turned even more electric. The host took the stage to welcome everyone, thanking them for attending the charity gala. Cameras flashed, people clapped politely, and waiters stood ready to serve the next course. Elena moved quietly behind the tables. Making sure everything stayed perfect, she had to be invisible, efficient, and calm, the unspoken rules of her job. But every time she walked past the piano, her eyes betrayed her. It wasn't just an instrument to her. It was a piece of her soul sitting there under the lights. It reminded her of the nights when she used to play until dawn, lost in melodies she never wrote down, because she believed she would have forever to create them. Now she barely had time to rest between shifts. At one point, she stopped near the edge of the stage to adjust a glass vase. Her fingers brushed the edge of the piano accidentally. The smooth surface felt like silk under her skin. She quickly pulled her hand back, glancing around to make sure no one saw. But in that brief touch, something stirred deep inside her, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The host announced that Victor Dane would be arriving shortly. The audience clapped with excitement. Elena felt her stomach twist, not with jealousy but with longing. She wished she could hear him play live just once. She had only heard him through cheap headphones, but hearing the notes fill the air in real life would be magical. As the music from the speakers played softly in the background, Elena continued her work. She placed bread baskets on the tables and poured wine carefully. The sound of laughter surrounded her, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She was remembering the small church where she first learned to play piano as a child. Her mother used to listen from the back pew, smiling proudly. "You play like you're talking to angels," she had said once. Now those memories felt like another lifetime. The pianist hadn't arrived yet, but the night was still young. The crowd sparkled, the lights shimmered, and the piano waited silently. Elena looked at it one last time before turning away. She didn't know it yet, but that same piano, that silent black giant, would soon change her life. It would hear her story, her pain, and her hope, and it would become the voice she had lost, the voice that the world was finally about to hear. The night was shining brighter than ever. The grand hall was full, and laughter floated in the air like bubbles. Waiters moved quickly between tables, serving plates of fine food and refilling crystal glasses. Elena worked silently, her movements graceful and practiced. From the corner of her eye, she could see the grand piano, still empty, still waiting. The clock on the wall showed 8:30, and the famous pianist Victor Dane was nowhere to be seen. At first no one noticed. The guests were busy enjoying their conversations and wine. But as time passed, a few began glancing toward the stage, wondering why the performance hadn't started. The host tried to keep everyone calm, smiling and cracking small jokes. But behind his polite smile, he was growing nervous. The whole evening had been built around Victor Dane's performance. He was the star, the one who was supposed to make this charity night unforgettable. Inside the kitchen, the staff whispered to each other. The manager's phone was pressed tightly against his ear, his face pale. "What do you mean you're still on the highway?" he hissed. "You were supposed to be here half an hour ago." A pause, then his voice rose again. "The crowd is waiting. You can't be late to a charity gala like this." He hung up, looking like he was about to faint. Elena passed by him, carrying a tray of desserts. She heard enough to understand what was happening. The pianist was late, stuck in traffic, and no one knew when he would arrive. The restaurant staff began to panic. The schedule was falling apart. The manager wiped sweat from his forehead and started pacing. "We need to stall, serve the next course slower. Make some announcements, do something," he muttered to himself. In the dining hall, the restless energy grew stronger. People began checking their watches and whispering, "Where is Victor Dane?" Someone asked from the front table. "He's always punctual," another replied. A few laughed nervously, but others were clearly annoyed. They hadn't come just for the food. They came for the performance. The show, the music. Elena tried to stay focused on her work, but her heart was racing. She could feel the tension spreading like a cold wind through the room. The elegant glow of the evening was fading. The atmosphere that had once felt magical now felt fragile. Like glass about to break, she walked past the piano and looked at it again. The spotlight was still on, lighting the empty chair and the untouched keys. The sight filled her with both sadness and longing. In that moment, she remembered something her piano teacher once said. The worst kind of silence is the one that waits for music. And that was exactly what the room felt like. A silence waiting to be broken. The manager rushed out from the kitchen, his face flushed. He gathered the staff quickly near the back corner. "Listen up," he said in a low but sharp voice. "Victor Dane is delayed. He says traffic might take another hour. We have to keep the guests happy until he arrives. Does anyone have any ideas?" The waiters exchanged nervous looks. No one spoke. Elena stood at the back, her heart beating faster. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her tray. The thought was already forming in her mind, but she was too afraid to say it. How could she, a simple waitress, suggest what she was thinking? She stared at the piano again. It felt like it was calling to her, reminding her of who she used to be. The silence dragged on until one of the waiters whispered, "Maybe we could play some background music from the speakers." The manager shook his head. "The sound system's not ready for live audio, and this crowd won't be impressed by background music. They came for a real performance, something elegant." He looked around again. Desperate, Elena bit her lip, her thoughts spinning. She had played for small crowds before, back in her school days. She had even performed in a few small competitions. She wasn't Victor Dane, but she could play well. She knew she could. Yet the idea of standing on that stage now, in front of all these powerful people, terrified her. The sound of murmurs from the hall grew louder. The guests were getting impatient. "This is ridiculous," someone said loudly. "We paid for a performance, not to sit here and wait." The manager's face turned red. He rubbed his temples. "I can't let this fall apart," he muttered under his breath. "We'll lose the restaurant's reputation." Then, almost without thinking, Elena took a small step forward. Her voice came out quiet but steady. "Sir," she said softly. The manager turned, frowning. "What is it, Elena?" "Make it quick," she hesitated, her heart pounding. I can play the piano, sir. If you want, I can play until Mr. Dane arrives." For a moment, no one spoke. The kitchen fell silent. The manager blinked at her as if he hadn't heard right. "You?" he said finally, his voice filled with disbelief. "You're a waitress, not a performer." A few waiters exchanged awkward glances. Some even tried to hide small smiles, thinking it was a joke. But Elena didn't back down. She took a deep breath. "Yes, sir, I used to study music before I worked here. I can play well enough to fill the silence just so the guests don't feel bored." The manager looked at her like she had just offered to fly a plane. He opened his mouth to argue, but then stopped. He was out of options. The guests were growing restless, and time was slipping away. Finally, he sighed. "Fine," he said sharply. "You've got 10 minutes if you embarrass us. You're finished, understand?" Elena nodded quickly, her palms sweating. She didn't care about the warning. All she cared about was the piano. The chance to touch the keys again. She walked toward the stage slowly, her legs trembling as she passed by the tables. She could feel eyes turning toward her, people whispering, confused about why a waitress was walking to the piano. When she reached the stage, she paused for a moment. The light above the piano felt warm on her skin. Her reflection shimmered on the black surface. She placed her fingers gently on the keys. They felt cold and smooth, just like she remembered. The chatter around her faded. All she could hear was her heartbeat and the silent promise she had made long ago, to never let her music die. The night that had started with chaos was about to change. No one in that elegant hall knew it yet. But the waitress, who had always been invisible, was about to make everyone listen. Elena stood beside the stage, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. The grand piano seemed larger now, almost intimidating under the bright light around her. The noise of the restless crowd filled the room. She could hear the low murmur of voices, the clinking of glasses, the impatient sighs of guests who were beginning to lose their excitement. The manager stood nearby, his face tense, his hands folded tightly behind his back. "You have 10 minutes, he whispered again, his tone sharp but uncertain. "Play something soft, something fancy, and for heaven's sake, don't mess it up." Elena nodded. Though her palms were sweating and her knees trembled, she took a deep breath. Trying to steady herself, her heart said yes, but her mind screamed no. This was madness. She was a waitress, not a performer. What if she made a mistake? What if they laughed at her? But then, as she looked at the piano, a strange calm began to fill her. It was as if the instrument was calling her back, whispering that this was her moment, the one she had been waiting for without even realizing it. As she walked up the small steps to the stage, the room seemed to grow quieter. People turned their heads, confused. Some frowned. Others whispered, "What is she doing? Isn't that the waitress? Where's Victor Dane?" The sound of whispers brushed against her like cold wind, but she kept walking. Her black shoes tapped softly against the wooden floor. When she reached the piano, she paused. Her hands hovered above the keys. She could see her reflection in the shiny black surface, the reflection of a girl who had once dreamed of music, the same girl who had locked those dreams away. She took another deep breath, remembering the nights when she used to play for her mother, the way her mother would smile and say, "You were born for this." Elena. That memory gave her strength. Behind her, the manager cleared his throat nervously. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, forcing a polite smile, due to unexpected traffic delays, "our guest performer will be arriving shortly. In the meantime, one of our own, Miss Elena, has kindly offered to play a short piece for you. Please give her a warm welcome." The applause was light, polite, and a little unsure. It wasn't the kind of applause that said, "We're excited." It was the kind that said, "Let's see what happens." Elena could feel their doubt. She could feel their eyes on her uniform, judging her. wondering how a waitress could dare to touch such a grand piano. She sat down slowly, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the seat. For a moment, she simply stared at the keys, the black and white pattern she knew so well. Her fingers twitched. Remembering their old rhythm, she closed her eyes, trying to block out everything and the noise, the lights, the stairs, and focused on one thing only, the music that had lived inside her all these years. At first, she couldn't move. Her breath came in short gasps. Then, almost on instinct, her fingers found the first few notes. A soft, hesitant melody filled the air, delicate and uncertain. Some people kept talking. A few even chuckled quietly. But as the seconds passed, her confidence grew. The notes became stronger, smoother. Each sound carried a piece of her story. Her sadness, her longing, her hope. The restaurant began to grow quiet. Conversations stopped one by one, the laughter faded. Even the waiters slowed their steps to listen. The room, which had been full of noise and impatience a moment ago, now hung on every note she played. Elena's world shrank to just the piano, her hands and the music. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She wasn't someone struggling to pay rent or hide her broken dreams. She was the girl who had once believed in beauty. In art, in the power of sound, her fingers moved faster, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. The melody changed, deepened, and the music began to tell a story of pain turning into strength, of a dream that refused to die. From the corner of the room, the manager stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. He had expected her to play a few clumsy notes, just enough to keep people distracted. But this was different. The music was alive. It filled the space like light flooding a dark room. The guests, who had been restless moments ago, now sat still, some even leaning forward. Completely captured by the sound, Elena didn't see them. She didn't see the astonished faces or the soft smiles. She was lost in the music. Her heart poured out through her fingertips, every emotion she had buried for years coming back to life. The melody rose and fell like waves, gentle and powerful all at once. For a brief moment she opened her eyes. The lights reflected off the piano, and she saw the faces watching her, not with judgment anymore, but with wonder. Her fear melted away. She smiled softly, her fingers gliding over the keys as if they had been waiting for this moment too. The song continued, growing more emotional. Every note seemed to say something words could not. The sound of the piano filled every corner of the hall, echoing off the glass and gold, wrapping around the people who listened in silence. The elite guests, who once ignored her presence, were now seeing her for the first time, not as a waitress, but as something else, an artist, a storyteller. When she finally reached the last few notes, she slowed down, letting the sound fade gently into silence. For a second, the room remained still. No one moved, no one spoke. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if waking from a dream, the crowd erupted into applause, not polite this time, but loud, full of surprise and admiration. Elena sat there, her hands still resting on the keys, her heart full, her eyes shiny with unshed tears. For the first time in years, she felt seen. She had faced her fear, stepped out of the shadows and let her soul speak. And as the applause echoed around her, she knew something had changed. This wasn't just a performance to fill a quiet moment. It was the beginning of something new, a spark that fate had been saving for her, a reminder that no dream truly dies if the heart keeps its song alive. The room was so quiet that Elena could hear her own heartbeat. She sat in front of the grand piano, her trembling fingers hovering just above the keys. The bright light from the chandelier shone on her face, making her eyes glisten. Around her, the elite crowd waited in curiosity. Some looked amused, others doubtful. They didn't believe a waitress could play in front of them. Not on a night like this. Not on a piano that cost more than her entire life savings. Her chest rose and fell as she took a deep breath. Her mind whispered 100 fears at once. What if I make a mistake? What if they laugh? What if I'm not good enough anymore? But then she remembered her mother's voice, soft and warm, saying, "When you play, don't think about who's watching, just talk to the piano. It listens better than people do." Those words gave her strength. Her fingers finally pressed the first note. A soft sound drifted into the air, trembling like her heartbeat. Then another and another slowly. A melody began to form. The crowd kept whispering at first, but their voices grew quiet as the music started to fill the room. It was a gentle tune, sweet and sad. Like a memory you can't forget. Elena's hands were still shaky, but as the seconds passed, her body began to remember. The years she had spent playing the piano came rushing back. The feel of the keys beneath her fingertips, the rhythm that used to live inside her heart, the emotions she had hidden away. They all returned like a wave. Her back straightened, her fingers moved with more confidence, and the sound grew stronger. The melody turned brighter, rising and falling like a soft conversation. Every note carried something, her pain, her hope, her dreams, her courage. She forgot about the expensive clothes, the golden lights, and the sharp eyes of the audience. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She wasn't a servant in someone else's story. She was Elena, the girl who once dreamed of music, who loved it so deeply that even life's cruelty couldn't silence it. The guests, one by one, stopped moving. The sound of forks against plates faded, the laughter disappeared. Even the waiters froze where they stood. Some people leaned forward in their chairs without realizing it. Their expressions softened. They had expected something simple, maybe clumsy. But what they were hearing was different. It was pure, emotional, and alive. Elena played as if her soul was speaking through the piano. Her fingers danced across the black and white keys like they were alive. Her eyes were closed now, her face peaceful yet filled with feeling. The music rose high, then fell low. It told a story without words, a story of loss, of courage, and of never giving up. It spoke of lonely nights, of tears wiped away in silence, of dreams that refused to die. People began to feel something they hadn't expected to feel that night. The kind of emotion that sneaks into your heart quietly. One woman at the front table held her glass still in midair. Forgetting to drink, a man beside her blinked, confused by the lump in his throat. Even the manager, who stood near the bar, couldn't look away. His eyes softened as he realized this was no ordinary performance. For Elena, time had stopped. She wasn't thinking anymore. The music flowed through her naturally. She moved with it, her hands a blur, her body leaning into every note. The restaurant that had once felt so cold now felt warm and alive. The sound filled every corner, wrapping the audience like a blanket of light. And then something incredible happened. She smiled. It was small and gentle, but it changed everything. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was free. Every note that came from the piano now was full of life, passion, and love. It was as if every hardship she had endured had transformed into music. Her soul was finally being heard. Minutes passed, though it felt like seconds. The song grew more emotional, her tempo faster, her movement stronger. Her hair slipped from its bun, falling softly around her face, but she didn't care. The sound of the piano became thunder and rain all at once. The kind of music that touches even those who pretend not to feel. By the time she reached the final part of her song, tears had formed in her eyes. She hit the last few notes gently, letting them fade into the quiet air like a whisper. The sound lingered for a moment, floating through the hall before disappearing into silence. And then nothing, pure absolute silence. For a few seconds no one moved. The guests sat frozen, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Elena kept her head down, afraid to look up. She didn't know if they loved it or hated it. Her hands were still trembling, her heart racing faster than ever. Then slowly someone began to clap. One pair of hands, then another and another. The sound grew louder, stronger, until it filled the whole hall. The people who had ignored her all night were now standing, clapping, cheering. Some even shouted, "Bravo!" In pure surprise, the applause was real. Warm and full of emotion, Elena lifted her head, her eyes wide with disbelief. She saw faces smiling, some even tearful. The same people who had once looked down on her were now clapping for her. And for the first time in years, she felt seen. She smiled softly, her lips trembling. She stood and bowed her head slightly. Overwhelmed with emotion, the manager wiped his face, pretending there was something in his eye. The waiters looked at her in awe. One whispered, "I didn't even know she could play." Elena sat back down for a moment, touching the piano gently. Whispering a quiet thank you to it, the applause continued, echoing in her ears like music of its own. In that moment, she didn't care about her uniform, her struggles, or her past. She had reminded herself, and everyone in that room, who she truly was. Her 10 minutes were over, but something inside her had awakened forever. That night, Elena didn't just play the piano. She played her heart, and the whole world finally listened. The room was silent, completely silent. The sound of the last piano note still floated in the air like a soft echo that refused to leave. Elena's fingers rested lightly on the keys, her chest rising and falling as she tried to catch her breath. For a moment she didn't dare look up. She was afraid that it had all been a mistake, afraid that the people in front of her would laugh or whisper the way they did before. But they didn't. No one moved, no one spoke. Every single person in that shining hall sat frozen, their faces soft, their eyes wide. It was as if time itself had stopped to listen. Elena finally lifted her eyes, her heart skipped a beat. The crowd, the same elegant crowd that once looked at her like she didn't belong, was now staring at her with something different, something she hadn't seen in a long time. Awe. The women in glittering dresses, the men in dark suits, the waiters by the walls. They all stood still. Some had their hands over their mouths. Some had tears in their eyes. The piano's reflection shimmered under the golden light. It looked alive, like it had become part of her. The grand restaurant that usually buzzed with laughter and noise now held only the soft hum of emotion. Elena could feel it, the shift in the air, the magic she had unknowingly created. For a few seconds there was nothing but stillness. Then slowly someone began to clap. It was a single sound at first, one person's hands meeting softly. Then another joined and another. The clapping grew louder, spreading through the room like a wave. The applause became thunder. Echoing against the marble walls, people stood up one by one, their faces shining with admiration. Elena's lips parted slightly, her eyes filling with tears. She couldn't believe it. The same people who hadn't even noticed her before were now on their feet, clapping for her, cheering for her. For years she had been invisible, just a quiet waitress who moved through the background. But now, every eye was on her, every heart was listening. She stood slowly from the piano bench, her hands shaking, and bowed her head slightly in gratitude. The applause only grew louder. She could hear people calling out "Bravo" and "Wonderful." Some even whistled, breaking the formal tone of the evening. But no one cared. The walls that divided class and status had disappeared for a moment, and all that remained was the music and the emotion it had created. The manager stood near the bar, completely speechless. His mouth was slightly open, his clipboard forgotten on the floor. He had never seen the guests react like this before. Even the host, who was supposed to lead the evening, looked stunned, whispering something like, "Who would have thought?" Elena smiled shyly, wiping the small tear that had escaped from her eye. She looked at the piano again and whispered softly, "Thank you," as if the instrument had shared her secret. Then, something unexpected happened. An older man near the front table stood up and said, "Play another." The crowd agreed, clapping again. Some guests started chanting lightly, asking her to play one more song. Elena froze for a second, her heart pounding once more. She hadn't planned to play another, but their energy, their warmth, gave her courage. She sat back down, her smile trembling but real. Her fingers touched the keys again, and she began to play a new tune, softer this time, more peaceful. The room fell silent again, listening. The melody flowed like a whisper, calm and warm. It felt like a lullaby for tired souls. The tension that had once filled the room completely vanished. The soft notes floated through the air, reaching every corner of the hall. People closed their eyes, lost in the beauty of the sound. One woman rested her hand on her husband's arm, tears rolling down her cheek. A young waiter near the kitchen door stood still, his mouth slightly open in amazement. Elena poured her heart into every note. She didn't play for fame or applause. She played because it was the only way she knew to speak her truth. Her music wasn't perfect. There were small mistakes. A missed key here and there, but no one noticed. No one cared because it was real, raw, and full of feeling. By the time the second song ended, some people in the room were openly crying. The applause this time came instantly. Louder than before, people stood again, clapping until their hands turned red. The energy was electric. Elena felt like her heart was glowing. She had never felt so alive, so understood behind her. The door to the restaurant opened quietly. A tall man in a dark suit stepped in, carrying a small black case. It was Victor Dane, the famous pianist. He had finally arrived. But as he entered, he stopped, confused. His eyes widened as he looked at the stage. He saw the young waitress sitting at his piano. Surrounded by standing guests and thunderous applause, he didn't say a word, he just watched. A faint smile touched his lips as he realized what had happened. He could see it in the faces of the people. She had given them something real, something even he, with all his fame, sometimes struggled to give. Elena looked up and saw him standing there, Her heart skipped a beat. For a second, she thought she would get in trouble. But then, to her surprise, Victor gave her a small nod, a quiet gesture of respect. It was as if he was saying, "The stage is yours." The crowd didn't even notice him at first. They were too busy cheering, clapping, calling her name. The sound filled the room like music itself. Elena stood again, her hands trembling. Her cheeks glowing with color, she bowed once more, her heart overflowing with gratitude. She could hardly believe what had just happened a few hours ago. She was invisible. Just another waitress working for tips. And now she was the reason this night would be remembered forever. As she stepped away from the piano, the light seemed warmer, the room brighter. The applause followed her like a wave of love in that moment. She understood something powerful. Music didn't care about uniforms, money, or status. It only cared about truth, about feeling. And tonight she had shared her truth with the world. For the first time in her life, Elena didn't feel small. She didn't feel forgotten. She felt like she belonged. Not because of who she served, but because of who she was. The sound of clapping and cheering still echoed as she smiled through her tears. Her dream, the one she thought she had lost forever, was no longer a dream. It was real, alive. And it had just begun. The crowd was still standing, clapping and cheering for Elena. The sound filled the entire restaurant like a storm of joy. Elena stood beside the grand piano, her heart racing, her cheeks warm with emotion. She had never imagined this moment, never thought that these people, the city's richest and most powerful, would applaud her. A simple waitress, the applause seemed to go on forever. Then slowly it began to fade and the sound of soft chatter replaced it. People were turning to each other, talking about what they had just witnessed. "Who is she?" One woman whispered. "That was incredible," said another. "She played like a professional." Someone else added, "Not like a professional, I'm better." Elena stood there, still in a daze. She couldn't move. Her legs felt weak. She pressed her hand against the piano to steady herself. The grand instrument glowed under the soft lights as if it too was proud of her. She smiled, tears filling her eyes again. It didn't feel real. She had spent years blending into the background, serving others quietly, and now all of a sudden, she was the center of attention. Just then, a quiet murmur spread through the hall. The front doors opened, and a tall man in a black suit entered, carrying a sleek piano case. His presence instantly drew attention. It was Victor Dane, the famous pianist everyone had been waiting for, the same man whose absence had thrown the entire evening into chaos. He paused at the entrance, his eyes scanning the room. He saw the guests still standing, still clapping softly, and then his gaze landed on the stage. There stood Elena, her uniform wrinkled, her hair slightly loose, her hand still trembling over the piano keys. He could tell right away what had happened. For a moment, Victor said nothing. He just stood there watching her. A faint smile appeared on his face, not a proud smile, but a respectful one. He walked slowly toward the stage, his shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. People turned and whispered, "He's here." "Victor Dane is here." Some guests straightened up. Others expected him to take over immediately, but he didn't. Elena noticed him when he was halfway across the room. Her heart froze. She gasped softly. The realization hit her. She had just played on his stage, on his piano, in front of his audience. Panic rose in her chest. What if he was angry? What if she had offended him? She wanted to disappear. She stepped back from the piano, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean to." But Victor raised a hand gently, stopping her. His expression was calm, kind even. He spoke softly, his voice smooth and deep. "Don't apologize," he said. "You've already done what I came here to do." The crowd fell silent. Everyone stared as Victor climbed the small steps to the stage. He stood beside Elena, looking at her with genuine admiration. "That was beautiful," he said quietly, "just for her. I heard the last few notes as I came in, and I could feel every emotion in them." Elena's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're not angry?" she asked nervously. He shook his head with a small laugh. "Angry? No, I should be thanking you. You turned a night that could have been ruined into something unforgettable." The audience listened, smiling. They had never seen Victor so humble. He turned to face them and said aloud, "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems you've already heard the best performance of the evening. I think I'll just enjoy being part of the audience tonight." The crowd erupted in laughter and applause again. Elena's face turned red. She looked down, unable to believe what was happening. Victor then leaned closer and said softly, "Tell me, what's your name?" "Elena," she whispered. "Elena Brooks." "Well, Elena," he said with a proud nod, "you have a gift, and gifts like that should never be hidden." He gestured to the piano and added with a smile, "You belong here." Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they were tears of pure happiness. For years she had doubted herself, thought her dreams were foolish. But now hearing those words from someone like Victor Dane made her heart soar. The audience began to clap again, louder this time, cheering for both of them. The manager, who had been standing in the corner completely shocked, stepped forward nervously. He tried to speak. "Mr. Dane, we didn't plan for this. She just—" But Victor interrupted him with a polite smile. "You should be proud. You have a hidden star working here." The manager blinked, unable to find words. He just nodded quickly, pretending he had known all along that Elena could play. The waiters behind him smiled secretly, watching their quiet co-worker being praised by one of the most famous musicians in the country. Elena could barely speak. Her throat felt tight. She whispered a soft, "Thank you," to Victor. He nodded, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Keep playing," he said kindly. "Don't stop because life gets hard. Music like yours deserves to be heard." With that, he stepped off the stage and joined the audience, taking a seat at one of the front tables. Everyone began talking excitedly. People came up to Elena, shaking her hand, complimenting her. A few asked if she had studied music. One older lady even asked if she could recommend her for a charity concert. Elena stood there, stunned, overwhelmed by the kindness. She couldn't stop smiling. She felt like her world had turned upside down, but in the best possible way. As the evening continued, the laughter and energy returned to the restaurant. But it was different now. Warmer, softer. The guests looked at Elena not as a waitress anymore, but as an artist, a young woman with talent and courage. Later that night, as the crowd began to leave, Victor stopped by her again. He smiled and said, "You reminded me why I fell in love with music. Don't ever lose that fire." Then he handed her his card. "If you ever need guidance, call me." Elena took the card in disbelief, holding it like it was made of gold. She wanted to say something, but all she could manage was a tearful, "I will. Thank you." When he left, she sat alone at the piano for a few more minutes. Her reflection shimmered on the black surface and she smiled softly to herself. That night, something changed inside her forever. She wasn't just the invisible waitress anymore. She was Elena Brooks, the girl who dared to play, who turned silence into music, and who made even the great Victor Dane step back and listen. The night had finally come to an end. The golden lights of the restaurant were dimming, and most of the guests had started to leave. Their laughter and soft chatter echoed as they walked out, still talking about the unforgettable performance they had witnessed. The once busy hall now looked peaceful, but for Elena, the moment still felt like a dream she didn't want to wake up from. She sat quietly at the piano, running her fingers gently over the keys, the same keys that had changed her life just hours ago. Her heart was full. She could still hear the echoes of the applause, the sound of people cheering for her. For years she had served those same people in silence, carrying plates and trays without being noticed, and now they were clapping for her, standing for her, smiling at her. It didn't feel real. Elena looked down at her hands, her fingertips still tingling from the music. These were the same hands that had washed dishes, carried heavy trays, and worked long hours for small pay. Yet tonight those same hands had brought an entire room of strangers to tears. She smiled softly, whispering, "We did it," as if talking to her own fingers. The restaurant was almost empty now. The manager had already left after shaking her hand awkwardly and mumbling something like, "Good job, Elena. Very unexpected." The other waiters had congratulated her too, their faces glowing with pride. One of them, a young man named Leo, had even said, "You're famous now, and laughed. Elena had laughed too. But deep down, she knew something really had changed. As she sat there lost in thought, she heard a soft voice behind her. "Still here?" She turned to see Victor Dane standing near the doorway, his coat over his arm. He smiled kindly and walked toward her. "I thought you'd already gone home." Elena stood up quickly, brushing her hands on her apron. "I was just thinking," she said shyly. "I still can't believe what happened." Victor chuckled. "That's what music does. It surprises everyone, even the one playing it." He looked at her with admiration. "You know, I've played in hundreds of halls in front of thousands of people, but I haven't seen a reaction like that in years. You didn't just play music, Elena, you told a story." She lowered her eyes, embarrassed but touched. "I didn't plan anything, I just played what I felt." "And that's why it worked," he said warmly. "Real music doesn't come from skill alone. It comes from feeling, and you have that." He took out a small card from his coat and handed it to her again. "I meant what I said earlier. If you ever decide to play seriously, call me. I can help you find the right people, the right stage. You have something rare." Elena stared at the card for a long moment. It had his name, number, and the logo of a music foundation. Her fingers trembled slightly as she took it. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know if I deserve this." Victor smiled. "You earned it, and don't ever think you don't deserve what's already yours." He gave her a nod and began walking toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back and added, "One more thing. Don't let this be your last performance, okay?" She nodded, tears forming in her eyes again. "I won't." After he left, the room felt quiet again. But it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. It wasn't heavy or lonely. It was peaceful, comforting. She looked around the empty restaurant that had witnessed her life for the past 2 years. Every table, every chair, every corner held memories of long nights, tired feet, and unspoken dreams. But now it also held something new: hope. Elena walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. They sparkled like tiny stars. She thought about her mother and wished she could have been there to see it. Her mother had always believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. "I did it, Mama," she whispered to the night sky. "I really did it." The thought made her smile. She felt lighter than she had in years. For the first time, the future didn't scare her. She didn't know exactly what would happen next, but she knew it would be something beautiful. The next morning, Elena returned to work, but things were different. As soon as she walked in, the chef grinned at her. "Our star pianist is here," he joked. The other waiters clapped and teased her kindly. Even the manager looked at her with a mix of pride and surprise. "We've had 5 people call this morning," he said. "They want to know who you are. Apparently, your performance is the talk of the town." Elena couldn't believe it. "Really?" she asked in shock. He nodded. "And there's a music reporter coming tomorrow. He wants to interview you, so don't disappear." She laughed, feeling her cheeks turn pink. Everything was happening so fast. She didn't know where this sudden attention would lead. But one thing was certain: her life would never be the same again. That night, after her shift ended, she stayed behind again. She sat at the piano, her old friend, and began to play softly. This time there was no fear, no hesitation. The notes flowed easily, gently filling the quiet hall. The sound was warm and full of life. As she played, she thought about how strange life was. A few hours ago, she was just another face in the crowd, and now she had found her voice. Her dream, which she thought had died long ago, had found its way back to her. When she finished, she rested her hands on the keys and closed her eyes. She whispered, "Thank you." Not just to the piano, but to life itself, for giving her a second chance. Outside, the night was calm. The moon hung high, shining through the big glass windows. Elena smiled, her heart full. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe success, maybe challenges. But she was ready, because now she wasn't just a waitress who used to dream. She was a pianist, a storyteller and a believer. Her journey had just begun, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of her music seemed to echo softly through the night, carrying her dream into the stars.